Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 26 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town, South Africa. Now finally on to the main event. I'm very pleased to be hosting my two colleagues, Alistair and Melissa, this evening. Alistair has a very diverse conservation background, working in conservation planning in KZN before he made the sensible move to working on seabirds. He did his PhD on African penguin foraging ecology in Algoa Bay, and then joined BirdLife in 2019 as the coastal seabird as the seabird conservation program. Melissa Lewis is the policy and advocacy program manager and brings a wealth of knowledge to the role, having worked as a legal advisor for the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement for a number of years, and she also completed her PhD on that organization. They are both very involved in working on threats to coastal seabirds, especially in Algoa Bay, as a result of the expanding ocean economy. And I'm sure they will share a lot of new insights for many of you. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So Alistair and Melissa, over to you.
Thanks, Christina, for the introduction. So tonight, Melissa and I will talk you through some of the emerging threats to seabirds in South Africa's exclusive economic zone, and to be fortunate to have Kirsten Day also available for any specific questions for her expertise at the end of this session. So I'm going to begin, and then Mel will jump in halfway through, and then I'll round it off at the end. So just an introduction to some of the background in terms of our seabird diversity within our exclusive economic zone. So as with all coastal nations, we have 200 nautical mile buffer around our coastline, shown there in the spotted grey line. It also includes a radius around the Prince Edward Islands in the south, which are South African territories, which also harbour a plethora of very important seabird assemblages. But the map you see on the right there shows all these different colors from red to blue, which represent sea surface temperatures. And they give a depiction of the diversity of habitats that play a central role in driving the seabird diversity in South African waters, from the warm Agulhas current in the east of South Africa, converging with the cold Bengal current in the west. But also further south, we have these convergence zones and subantarctic and polar fronts that also drive a lot of productivity and attraction to many seabird species. And many of these seabird species, unfortunately, are under threat from well-known threats to seabirds globally. So seabirds are the most threatened group of birds globally. And some of the major threats to seabirds all around the world include invasive alien mammals, such as the mice from Marion Island, the most predominant at-sea threat in the form of bycatch, resource competition with fisheries, chemical and noise pollution, climate change, and lots of other threats as well. But those are the predominant ones that a lot of people are working on. Another interesting feature of our marine habitat is the cold Benguela upwelling system, mostly to the west and south of South Africa, going into Namibia and Angola as well, which harbors 7 endemic species, more than half of which are threatened. And those species are the ones that the Seabird Conservation Program, together with its partners, focuses a lot of its attention on. So these are the 7 Benguela endemics that are limited to this Benguela upwelling region. There's three cormorant species, so the crown cormorant at the top there, and the Cape and bank cormorants at the bottom. We also have the Cape gannets, African penguins, Damara tern, and heartlobed gull. Unfortunately, 4 of these species are currently listed as endangered since 2010, and 3 of those, the African penguin, Cape gannet, and Cape cormorant, are all forage fish specialists. So they all face very similar threats. And that is the focus of a lot of our efforts at the coastal seabird projects in BirdLife South Africa. So as with most animals, there are natural threats that we need to distinguish from the human-induced threats. So while I've got natural there in inverted commas, because things like disease, like avian influenza, which had a huge impact on Cape Cormorants last year, is sort of classified as a natural threat, but it is influenced by other patterns in the globe that have influences by humans, for instance, poultry farming. But other natural threats include predation. So Cape fur seals are well-known predators of especially Cape gannet juveniles. And also African penguins. And then kelp gulls are also well known to take eggs of many seabirds in the Bengal ecosystem. But the focus of our efforts is more around anthropogenic threats. So one of the big threats to 3 of the 4 endangered Bengal seabirds is related to their prey. So we do focus a lot of our efforts on advocating for the mitigation of resource competition in the form of purse seine fishing around sensitive areas where African penguins concentrate their foraging. But there also are other threats that are more sometimes catastrophic, but not continuous, such as oil spills, especially the treasure oil spill in 2000, which had a significant impact on penguins on the West Coast. But what this talk is really focusing on is some of the emerging threats. Some of them have been around for some time, but they've become more prominent lately, especially with research into the impacts of these threats and the expanding economy. Some of those are related to increase in vessel traffic and associated maritime activities, and also prospecting for oil and gas, such as seismic surveys. So what is the ocean economy? So we often hear the ocean economy and the blue economy mentioned interchangeably. The ocean economy has been around for some time, for centuries, especially when we look at activities such as fishing and the transfer of goods between different nations. There are other activities and sectors that are more recent, like, for instance, communication, but many of these have proliferated in many years, and there's been a growing impetus to understand and manage these activities in light of the environment in a more sustainable manner, and hence the term the blue economy. So some of the prominent sectors that we all aware of in the ocean economy are ones such as fishing, and fishing has increased exponentially since the 1950s, especially since 1980, with the number of vessels, as you can see by this study, increasing really significantly in the last few decades. And interestingly, regardless of an improvement in technology to both locate and to catch fish, catch per unit effort in most regions around the world have actually decreased. So this is a clear indication that our fish stocks are under pressure. And if you look at the global footprint of fishing, it's really extensive. So it's about 55% of the surface of the ocean. That's 4 times the surface area of agriculture on land. And this is driven to a large extent by longline fishing effort, which is the most extensive. But there are other fleets operating, such as the trawl fishing fleet. And together, these fleets have a serious impact on seaboard mortalities, especially pelagic seabird bycatch. But since the turn of the century, there's been a lot of focus by biologists and bioacoustic researchers on the impacts of marine noise pollution. And this has come to light in parallel to the expansion of the marine economy, of the ocean economy. And it comes from many different sources. So it comes from vessel traffic, all different types of ships, from small boats to large ore carriers. It comes from explosives, seismic surveys, multi-beam sonar, pile driving, wind farms, you name it. There are so many different sources of sound, anthropogenic sound in the ocean. And the interesting thing about this graph and this review by Duarte is that a lot of these activities overlap the range in frequencies, hearing frequencies of a diversity of animals, from whales and dolphins to sharks, fish, turtles, seabirds, and even invertebrates. So this is a serious concern to many biologists and conservationists. And in recent times, there have been many reviews of the extent of marine noise pollution, and also what can be done to mitigate marine noise pollution. And this is an interesting document that just came out this year by the Convention on Biological Diversity, which outlines and summarizes this situation quite well. So one of the predominant sources of consistent marine noise pollution is shipping traffic. And this study basically shows us how shipping traffic has increased in the 2 decades straddling the turn of this century. So, as with fishing, vessel numbers have increased drastically, but also the distribution of those vessels, given the different trade routes since globalization, especially in the Indian Ocean, as you can see in the bottom, and particularly in Southeast Asia and parts of the Atlantic. And shipping traffic has also come to light in many nations, and many agencies have developed regulations to mitigate the effects of shipping noise, especially on whales and dolphin species off America and in the Mediterranean. There's some interesting projects there that have implemented some real-time mitigation measures to prevent noise pollution in busy parts of our ocean. So closer to home in South Africa, there's also been an impetus to drive our ocean economy through a project known as Operation Phakisa, especially the ocean economy sector of that project. And this started in 2014, basically to fast track some of the economic drivers that were identified in national planning. And these were focused on 9 different sectors, including marine transport and manufacturing, tourism, offshore oil and gas, including prospecting, construction, renewable energy, fisheries and aquaculture, communication, desalination, and marine protection services. So just to have a look at one of these focal sectors, oil and gas. This is a sector that's been active actually since the 1960s, when the first offshore prospecting was done, with a few wells being drilled just offshore of Plettenberg Bay. But there was a lull in prospecting during the apartheid era, mostly due to sanctions from international companies. But this regained impetus after, in the late 90s, early 2000s, with the proliferation of more prospecting. There's hundreds of wells now that have been drilled. There's also been a lot of prospecting in terms of seismic surveys. There's been over 200,000 kilometers of 2D seismic surveys that have been conducted, and over 10,000 square kilometers of 3D seismic surveys that have taken place since this time. And as you can see in this map, those light sort of yellow areas, beige colored areas, are ones that are under application. So there are more seismic surveys to come. And we're particularly concerned about the noise emanating from these activities in areas that overlap habitat for threatened Bengal species, such as African penguins, Cape gannets, Cape cormorants. Another activity that has expanded quite significantly in recent years since Operation Phakisa has been the rollout of different aquaculture projects, especially in sheltered bays. So Algoa Bay and Saldanha Bay come to light, especially Saldanha Bay has had many different projects that are rolled out there. And unfortunately, a lot of these sheltered bays are also the home to some islands with important seabirds, such as African penguins and Cape cormorants and Cape gannets. We're particularly concerned about finfish farming, the use of anti-fouling and therapeutic chemicals in that practice, especially for marine top predators that are susceptible to bioaccumulation, like seabirds. But getting back to marine noise pollution, because that's a lot of the focus of this talk, because it comes from a lot of these sources and activities in the ocean economy. The history of known impacts from marine noise pollution to seabirds actually has its origins, as far as I know, in 1977, when John Cooper was involved in this review of mitigation for blasting in Saldanha Bay. So what they were trying to do was open up the channel to allow big ore carriers to access the new iron ore terminal in Saldanha Bay, and they had to blast through some of the hard rock in the bay, and then they noticed a lot of dead birds washing up on the shore. So by the time John Cooper got there, and during some of the mitigation activities, he recorded over 1,000 seabirds that washed up on the shores. And interestingly, most of these, barring 5 kelp gulls, were all diving seabirds. So African penguins and Cape cormorants had spent a considerable time underwater. But since this time, and since the advances in technology, especially around research into the movements of seabirds, seismic activities in Algoa Bay in 2013 were studied by Lorraine Pichigru and colleagues to look at the impacts of this activity within 100 kilometers of birds at St. Croix Island and further afield at Bird Island. So what they found from GPS technology was that during the seismic activities, the birds moved far to the east, so further away from their normal distribution. So those are the blue circles during the survey, and their normal distribution is the black and gray. And we didn't find much movement differences at Bird Island, which are further away from the seismic surveys. And once these seismic surveys were over, the birds resorted back to their normal foraging range. And during seismic surveys, the birds traveled further, and we know that an increase in foraging effort has a direct bearing on breeding success. So after these seismic survey activities ceased, the birds did resort back to their normal behaviors, but it was a clear indication that this activity had an effect, far beyond, hundreds of meters from the activity. So in tens of kilometers, these activities have an impact on African penguins, and we suspect this is due to behavioral avoidance. And even more recently, since that study, Renee Skuman from Nelson Mandela University and colleagues have mapped the noise landscape, or the noisescape, within Algoa Bay and further afield to Port St. Francis. And they've controlled for both natural sound, so there's a lot of natural sound coming from wind especially, and then also anthropogenic sound. But as you can see by this noisescape map on the left, a lot of the noise is actually coming from the shipping lanes in Algoa Bay. So if you look at the map on the right, that is vessel traffic in 2015, but quite worryingly, since 2015, that vessel traffic has increased quite significantly. And that's what prompted us to look at the impacts of this increase in vessel traffic, especially on the population of African penguins at St. Croix Island, which started to crash since 2015, since 2016, and since vessels started to increase in the bay due to the availability of ship-to-ship bunkering activities, which is basically refueling outside of harbors. So this is a study that's just been published in Science of the Total Environment. And basically what we did was we looked at automated identification system data, which is compulsory data for ships over a certain size to transmit for navigation and other purposes. So that gives you an indication of the number and the identification of the ships in certain areas. So we looked at this data both before the advent of ship-to-ship bunkering and during ship-to-ship bunkering, so from 2015 to 2019. We translated these different vessel types and numbers into noise estimates from known algorithms in the literature. And then we compared the estimated noise increase to the decline in African penguins from St. Croix Island. And what we found just with the shipping vessel traffic was that since the advent of ship-to-ship bunkering in 2016, that vessels more than doubled in the bay in terms of numbers, with a 10-fold increase in really large bulk carrier vessels. And these are the ones that are mostly bunkered in the bay. and they're also very noisy vessels as well. So as you can see there in that green slope, after that change point 1 in 2016, it was a rapid increase in bulk carriers, and this increased again in 2019 when bunkering activities increased in the bay. So how did this affect penguins? So when we translate that vessel traffic increase into noise and correlate it to the populations of African penguins, we found a strong negative correlation with the numbers of African penguins in St. Croix Island, which before ship-to-ship bunkering was the largest global colony with over 6,000 pairs, and it's currently sitting at about 1,200 pairs in the latest counts this year. So over 80% decrease in that population since the advent of these activities, which we suspect is driven to a large extent by habitat displacement of these birds due to disturbance such as noise pollution. So what can we actually do to mitigate marine noise pollution? So we need to sort of approach this in a structured manner. We need to use science. BirdLife South Africa and partners are science-based organizations. So we do need to have the evidence at our disposal to both identify these threats, but also to understand the drivers of these threats, the critical thresholds, for instance, in noise pollution that drive a certain response in seabirds, whether that's a response in their foraging behavior and the numbers of birds breeding on the islands, or the numbers of dead birds that wash up on the shores. We need to understand what are these levels of noise or other threats that are driving these concerning declines. And once we have that information, then we can hopefully represent those both in time and space. And with that information, we can apply that to some form of mitigation hierarchy. So a mitigation hierarchy is a well-known process that looks at both preventative measures. So in terms of preventative measures, it looks at firstly, first prize, avoidance. So how can we prevent these activities from happening within these sensitive areas? And that can happen spatially, so avoiding sensitive areas altogether, but it can also happen temporally, so avoiding areas during the breeding season, for instance, or other sensitive periods in the life cycle of different species. Another preventative measure can be minimization. So there are many examples overseas to mitigate noise pollution, especially from vessel traffic, and these can be associated with altering the design of parts of vessels that emanate most of the noise. So that's usually around cavitation around the propellers, but it can also influence the operational management of these vessels. So speed restrictions, for instance, have a huge impact on noise reduction. There are also other emerging technologies, they call them quieting technologies, that have produced alternatives to, for instance, seismic surveys using marine, let's see if I can pronounce this right, marine vibro seas instead of air guns. And then last resort, if these measures aren't successful, are so-called remediated impacts. And these are going to be very difficult for mitigating against noise pollution, but generally they include restoration and offsets. But just to emphasize, these are last resorts. We want to maintain the habitat's quality and prevent these threats from influencing, especially these threatened species. And within this whole sort of framework, we need to apply an adaptive management framework, because these are emerging threats and the science is so young on a lot of these, especially in marine noise pollution. We need to update our knowledge as new information comes in and apply this information to updated mitigation measures. So we need to think adaptive throughout this process. And on top of that, within just something that's worth bearing in mind is that when we tackle these new and emerging threats, like those associated with marine noise pollution, we really need to be cognizant of cumulative pressures and their overlaps with threatened species. So when a new emerging threat, such as ship-to-ship bunkering or seismic surveys, comes into play, we need to assess the impact of those threats in light of the current threats to seabirds in our EEZ. So quite a neat resource that the National Biodiversity Assessment in 2018 produced was this cumulative sort of impact map. And this is shaded in different shades of red. So higher shades of red are higher areas of cumulative impacts. So there's been about 31 layers that have gone into this composite layer, and they include all sorts of human activities. So lots of different fishing activities, from purse seine, longline, and a whole bunch of other fleets, also to the maritime sector, so shipping, traffic, and also oil and gas activities as well. So if you look at the overlay of the three birds, the three Bengal seabird endemics that we focus a lot of our work on, African penguins, for instance, at their 7 last remaining large colonies, you can see there's a big overlap over high impact cumulative degraded habitat there. Very similarly for Cape gannets, another endangered Bengal endemic, and the same thing for Cape cormorants. So all these birds, known foraging ranges around their breeding colonies, have considerable overlap with these cumulative impacts that already exist. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mel. He's also going to talk a bit more about this in detail and what the policy and advocacy program are doing to tackle some of these threats. Over to you, Mel.
Thanks very much, Alistair. And so now that Alistair's provided a really nice overview of some of the key threats, key emerging threats facing seabirds in South Africa's exclusive economic zone, what I'm going to do is try to briefly contextualize those within the legal frameworks applicable to South Africa and within South Africa, and then give some examples of BirdLife South Africa's responses to particular threats. So starting off quite briefly, I just want to provide a bit of international perspective, because I think it is always important to bear in mind that South Africa as a country has undertaken numerous international commitments in respect of the marine environment and in respect of marine species. And those are found embedded in a number of different types of treaties. Some of these seek to address or the unsustainable exploitation of fisheries. Some of them focus on the conservation and sustainable use of specific ecosystems. So interestingly, there's actually a treaty between South Africa, Namibia, and Angola that is even specifically dedicated to the Benguela current large marine ecosystem, which, as Alistair has highlighted, is a priority area for BirdLife South Africa, and which seeks to protect this ecosystem from adverse impacts. Then an ecosystem-based treaty that I think some of you will be a bit more familiar with is the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance. Why is that relevant to seabirds? Well, because the convention uses a very broad definition of wetland, which also includes certain marine areas. And in fact, there are certain coastal islands within the Benguela system that have been designated as wetlands of international importance by South Africa, an example being Dassin Island. And then finally, you've got your instruments that focus on biodiversity conservation or the conservation of specific species, such as specific species of pelagic seabirds or species of migratory water birds. And here again, if one looks at the definitions employed, these are sufficiently broad that various coastal seabirds, such as the African penguin, are defined internationally as migratory water birds and are covered by the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement. So BirdLife South Africa, as a species conservation organization, obviously focuses in large measure on this final category. And on that note, Alistair, if you can just change the slide, please. Al, can you change that? Thanks. What I think is important to bear in mind, and a point that I just wanted to highlight, is that if one looks at the legal texts of these species-specific instruments, as well as various interpretive and implementation guidance that have been adopted by their governing bodies, we do see that they do cover pretty much the full range of threats that Alistair has highlighted in some way or another. So when one looks, for example, at the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement's legal text, there are explicit provisions on minimizing fisheries impacts on seabirds. There are explicit provisions on prohibiting significant disturbance and on tackling the threats related to aquaculture, for instance. And then if we look at some of the guidance and decisions and resolutions that have been adopted under instruments such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention on Migratory Species, those have addressed a wide range of topics, including, for instance, marine noise pollution, and there are various exhortations to states in those documents regarding how to address these impacts upon priority marine species. And then also just to flag that when it comes to the Bengal seabird specifically, there is also an internationally adopted species action plan, which goes into a lot more detail about the threats facing these species and the actions needed to address those. So my point essentially is that there's a wealth of international law and international guidance on addressing these various threats from a species conservation perspective. So how do we take that into account as BirdLife South Africa? How do we use it in our policy and advocacy work? You can keep on the previous slide, sorry, Alistair, almost there. Well, we first of all highlight the relevance of these provisions and these guidance documents in our advocacy efforts towards strengthening South African law and policy. So for instance, at the moment, there is a new draft biodiversity management plan for the African penguin that's open for public comment, and we will be flagging various of these international guidance documents and commitments in our comments on that plan. We'd also take them into consideration and highlight them in our comments on particular development applications to strengthen those comments. And then at times we'd even remind governments explicitly that if it ignores these commitments, there are mechanisms through which government can be called upon to account for this at the international level. Thanks, Alistair, you can change. So just shifting then to the South African legal context, there are again various laws that are relevant to seabird conservation, and the list on the slide isn't exhaustive, but suffice it to say that South Africa does have a variety of legal mechanisms for protecting seabird habitats, for restricting or prohibiting certain harmful activities, and for ensuring that the authorization of potentially harmful activities is properly informed by risk assessments. So when we're talking about BirdLife South Africa's advocacy responses to problematic activities, these are centered in large measure on the National Environmental Management Act, or NEMA, and the regulations that have been gazetted under that act. And that is firstly because much of our reactive advocacy work occurs within the framework of the environmental impact assessment process and associated appeals that are provided for by NEMA and its regulations. But an additional point that I want to emphasize regarding NEMA is that it does also in section 2 list a collection of what are referred to as national environmental management principles. And these must be taken into account by any organ of state whose activities may significantly affect the environment. So they're not only relevant to decisions following environmental impact assessments, they're not only relevant to the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, they're also relevant, for example, to the Transnational Port Authority when it's authorizing activities that may adversely affect the marine environment, and they need to be taken into consideration. So there's quite a long list of principles, and two that I just wanted to flag was that the principles do explicitly refer to the need for a risk-averse and cautious approach. So what's commonly referred to as the precautionary principle, or in the face of uncertainty, erring on the side of caution. And then Alistair referred to the mitigation hierarchy, and I just wanted to emphasize that this is also embedded in those principles. So the idea of the sequential approach to impact mitigation, where the emphasis is placed in the first instance on avoidance before progressing to minimization of impacts or remediation of impacts. And then as a final point, just also applicable across the board, are South Africa's principles of administrative justice, which include that government decision-making needs to be not only lawful, but also reasonable and procedurally fair. And these are principles that we rely upon in a good deal of our advocacy work as well. Thanks, Alistair. If you can change the slide. Okay, so when it comes to commenting on or objecting to particular development applications or decisions, this is a collaborative effort between BirdLife South Africa's Policy and Advocacy Program and our Seabird Conservation Program. So Alistair's team is really great to work with. What usually happens is that they'll provide an initial draft of comments expressing their concerns, and the Policy and Advocacy team will then provide inputs and additions to those. But I just wanted to quickly give you an indication of the types of questions that we consider and discuss in determining whether, in the first instance, to get involved in a particular matter, and if we are getting involved, just what our position is going to be, what our comments are going to be, whether we're going to submit objections. So first and foremost, obviously, we need to consider the location, not only the geographic scope of the activity itself, but if we have a better sense of its range of influence, as Alistair flagged in respect of seismic surveys, the range of influence expands considerably beyond the immediate footprint of the activity. We can consider the overlap between this area and the geographic range of our priority species. And Alistair's already given an explanation of the coastal seabirds that are key priorities for BirdLife South Africa. We wouldn't just consider the geographic overlap, we'd also consider temporal overlap with sensitive life history stages, such as breeding. We'd look at whether all relevant laws and policies have been considered. We'd look at whether there's been consideration of both direct and indirect impacts on our priority species, and whether there's been an adequate assessment of those impacts. We'd also look at whether cumulative impacts are being considered. And Alistair has highlighted the importance of these. The importance of not simply considering a particular development proposal in isolation, but considering its combined negative impacts with existing activities, but also likely activities. So not necessarily only the activities that are currently occurring in the area, but also activities that have been approved but haven't yet commenced. Or even activities that are in the approval process, to the extent that information about that is available. And then finally, we would, as a key question, consider how the mitigation hierarchy has been applied, whether there's been meaningful consideration of avoidance. If avoidance isn't being proposed, then what the justification for that is. What other mitigation measures are being proposed, and importantly, what justifications have been given for the belief that they'll be effective. It's not sufficient simply to give a long laundry list of proposed mitigation measures. There actually needs to be some evidence base provided to suggest that they'll be effective. And importantly, as I highlighted on the previous slide, South African law and South Africa's national environmental management principles does emphasize the risk-averse and cautious approach. So to the extent that there's uncertainty regarding particular impacts or the efficacy of particular mitigation measures, in simple terms, we'd always advocate that the species be given the benefit of the doubt. Right, so now I'm just going to run through a few examples, just bearing those questions in mind, of BirdLife South Africa's recent responses to particular development proposals or decisions. So already in this presentation and indeed in the introduction by Christina, there were some comments regarding seismic surveys and the concerns that numerous stakeholders have raised about these. So our seabird conservation experts have, as Alistair highlighted, become increasingly concerned about the effectiveness of mitigation measures in addressing negative impacts of seismic surveys on endangered seabirds. Our most significant concern over the past year was one particular application by CGG Services because of its close proximity to Algoa Bay, its overlap with important at-sea habitat for endangered seabirds, and because the proposed timing overlapped especially sensitive life history stages for some species, including post-molt and pre-breeding for African penguins and breeding periods for African penguins and Cape gannets. So that was an application in respect of which we submitted a very detailed outright objection to the proposed seismic surveys. And then subsequent to that, you may well have heard in the news about the interdict applications regarding the search seismic surveys. Our seabird conservation team did provide an affidavit to support the application for that interdict, which was ultimately obtained. Okay, next example. Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, so Al did also highlight concerns that BirdLife South Africa has had in respect of finfish farming in Algoa Bay. Specifically in an area in extremely close proximity to the marine protected area in Algoa Bay. So yeah, you can see Alice is just indicating that now the little kind of pink square marked 7 is the location of the finfish farming proposal in respect of which we were particularly concerned. This was a proposal that was authorized. We did submit an administrative appeal. And here the grounds for our appeal highlighted or were based on a number of points. Firstly, that the EIA hadn't included a full investigation of potential impacts on African penguins specifically, despite this location being in very close proximity to St. Croix Islands, which you can see indicated by a circle within the marine protected area, as Alice is indicating. The EIA also hadn't taken into account the cumulative impacts of other activities on this species, nor had it considered the various plans that had been developed to promote African penguins recovery. And in addition to that, the EIA itself had expressed low confidence regarding the effectiveness of certain of the proposed mitigation measures. So we really didn't feel that this was an approval that should have been granted. Various other stakeholders felt the same way. There were several internal appeals. Unfortunately, in this instance, none of those were successful. They were all ultimately dismissed by the decision maker. And so this wasn't a success story, although obviously this now is an activity that would need to be taken into consideration in assessing cumulative impacts on other proposed activities on the same marine resources. Thanks, Al. Can you change? Another controversial issue in recent times, which I'm sure you would have read about in the news, have been the gas to power applications by Car Powership. So we objected specifically to the applications in Algoa Bay and Saldanha Bay. And our principal concern from a seabird conservation perspective in this context was really the outright inadequacy of the EIA when it came to quantifying underwater noise emissions and their impacts on endangered seabirds. This is something that had been flagged repeatedly in the scoping phase of the projects and by certain experts as needing to be explored, and it simply wasn't comprehensively explored in the EIA. So we objected. The applications for environmental authorizations were ultimately refused, but Car Powership and several other stakeholders did take those refusals on appeal. We also submitted comments on the appeals to rebut various of their arguments. And just a few days ago, we heard the results of those appeals, and essentially the result is that the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, Barbara Creasy, has agreed that there were various gaps in information in the EIA and deficiencies in the public participation process that didn't allow for informed decision making. So she's essentially remitted the matter back to the competent authority so that these gaps in information can be addressed, presumably through additional studies, and the matter can be re-adjudicated. So this is a situation where there's been qualified success, but very much kind of watch this space situation to see what happens next with Car Powerships. And thanks, Alistair. Can you just change to my final slide? The final example I'm going to give relates to a matter that's been quite complicated to navigate, not only because of our evolving understanding of the types of risks involved, but also because it concerns an activity that doesn't currently require an environmental impact assessment under the EIA regulations. And this is ship-to-ship bunkering, which, as Alistair explained, is basically the offshore transfer of fuel from one vessel to another. So it doesn't require an EIA, does require permission from the South African Maritime Safety Authority, SAMSA, under the Marine Pollution Control and Civil Liability Act, and a license from the Transnet National Ports Authority, TNPA, in terms of the port rules. So the first operators for this activity in Algoa Bay were approved back in 2016. These approvals hadn't been preceded by a risk assessment, hadn't been preceded by any meaningful public consultation. There have been various concerns over the years, initially regarding the threat of oil spills, and there have been 4 oil spills in the bay as a result of this activity since it commenced. But as Alistair highlighted more recently, the focus of our concern has really been on the activity's impacts through increasing ship vessel traffic and associated noise pollution. So in 2019, after the second oil spill, a moratorium was placed on the issuance of new licenses, but existing operators could remain in place. And that has caused some controversies. So, and then more recently, there's been controversy regarding when and how the moratorium will be lifted. So there are a variety of stakeholders that have engaged on this matter. I'm just going to run through very briefly the engagement that BirdLife South Africa has had. So back in 2019, our first step was to partner with several other stakeholders to submit a letter of concern to the Ministry of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. This was before the initial imposition of the moratorium. More recently, early last year, we were able to use the International Working Group on the Bengal Seabirds as an opportunity to engage the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment and various international stakeholders on our concerns regarding this matter. And in fact, the rolling implementation plan of that working group does now flag ship-to-ship bunkering as a concern, does flag the need for an assessment of its environmental impacts and the need to consider and address associated noise pollution. And then in the second half of last year, we joined what was then known as the Bunkering Environmental Working Group. Now it's referred to as the Offshore Operations Environmental Working Group. But basically, our motivation for joining this forum was firstly to ensure that our positions on this activity were well informed, and secondly, to have a meaningful avenue to engage the relevant organs of state in a more proactive and constructive manner. As I indicated just now, there was some controversy earlier this year when there was an announcement that the moratorium was going to be lifted for Algoa Bay. This is something that we and other stakeholders objected to strongly and publicly. We were very vocal in the press about it, and as well as in stakeholder meetings. And really here our concerns have been both procedural, so the decision had been made without adequate stakeholder consultation, but also substantive insofar as there hasn't been a meaningful environmental risk assessment undertaken regarding this activity in the Bay, despite the fact that the understanding had been that the moratorium needed to remain in place until there had been an environmental risk assessment. And despite the ecological sensitivity of the area, and as we've highlighted repeatedly throughout this presentation, the various cumulative impacts that the species in this area, including endangered seabirds such as the African penguin, are facing. So there's a lot of backlash against that decision. Ultimately, it was reversed. So the moratorium on new licenses remains in place. And so moving forward, our focus is really on engaging with government, and we have already been engaging with the Transnet National Port Authority on the environmental risk assessment and what we expect to see in that regard in terms of consideration, not only of the risk of oil spills, but also more indirect impacts such as the impacts associated with increased ship vessel traffic. We've also highlighted the importance of cumulative impacts again, and the need for meaningful stakeholder engagement throughout the process. So we're actively engaging on that, and we'll continue to do so. And then as a final note, in parallel, there have been moves to develop a bunkering code that's going to ultimately provide the overarching kind of framework for applications for this activity. And we did submit detailed comments on the draft of that code. Basically, here again, trying to ensure that the code provides for meaningful consideration and, well, assessment and consideration of environmental impacts and future applications, and meaningful opportunities for public comments on individual applications. And we're waiting to see the final version of that code at the moment. It will hopefully be out very soon. So on that note, I'm going to hand back over to Alistair, who's going to be talking about some of BirdLife South Africa's more proactive conservation work, which, amongst other things, aims to improve our understanding of some of these threats that we've discussed this evening. And so in the future, it will hopefully really help to inform our responses to some of these types of applications that I've discussed, and also hopefully help to inform the decision-making of government decision makers. Thanks very much, Alistair.
Great, thanks, Mal. Yeah, so as Mal mentioned, BirdLife and other partners, including SANCOP, have been involved in the development of various tools that we can use to monitor the performance and condition of African penguins in real time. So these tools, we are hoping, can be used by the relevant authorities and resource managers to flag instances when these birds are undergoing adverse habitat conditions. So one of these systems that was invented quite some time back by Australians in the Antarctic is an automated penguin monitoring system. So we've installed a prototype developed by engineers at UCT at St. Croix Island. This is over here, and what it consists of is basically a scale or weighbridge, an RFID pit tag reader. So this is a device that reads individually marked pit tags that have been inserted into a proportion of the population. And this information is transferred then to a computer processor, a power unit, and a transmitter, so that this information can be transmitted in real time. And this is a project that's in development. We also, with the help of a new engineer, Pierre Retief, developing an upgraded 2-scale system at Stony Point. Very similar concept, just a bit more accurate in terms of getting the direction of the movements of the birds, but also more accurate weight measurements. There's Pierre Retief there, who's been incredibly helpful in this project. And we're busy at the stage of calibrating the scale with these automated penguin monitoring systems with independent scales, so that we can verify that the weights are actually accurate, especially considering the movements of the birds over the scale. So our intention is to install these systems, another one in Algoa Bay in the next month, and another one at Dyer Island towards the beginning of next year in some of the larger African penguin colonies. Just to give you an idea of how we're calibrating these systems, this is our independent scale at Stony Point. And this is to just double check that our scales in the background, they are actually measuring things correctly. So Pierre will go and compare this calibration scale data to the actual scales that will remain there for the long term. So once this is complete, we need to write this up so that we can defend this approach. And we can use it in some of these adaptive management measures that would hopefully inform the mitigation hierarchy that Mel mentioned as well. We're also teaming up with bioacoustics researchers at the University of Paris-Saclay to try and identify these marine noise thresholds that are really crucial, that we're going to motivate for either avoiding sensitive areas with marine noise pollution activities, or at the very least minimizing the impacts of these activities. And what Andrea Theobald, who's heading up this project, is doing is first describing the at-sea local vocal communications of birds, both above and below the water, quantifying the acoustic foraging network of these birds, so quantifying how important different calling networks between different individuals and groups are, and then evaluating the potential impacts of anthropogenic marine noise on these communication systems. So this year we also deployed in situ hydrophones in 2 locations in Algoa Bay to record the ambient noise levels there. And we have been deploying miniature hydrophones on a subset of penguins to look at the reactions of these birds to different thresholds in marine noise levels. So that's some of the proactive work that will tie most certainly into some of the great work the Policy and Advocacy Program are doing to defend some of these applications, and also to mitigate should some of these applications be accepted. And with that, I'd just like to say, yeah, thanks for everyone for listening. Thanks, Mel, for that incredible input. And thanks, Kirsten, for being in the background to answer questions, and Christina for hosting this.
Great. Thanks so much, Alistair and Melissa. Yeah, that was a very insightful presentation. It shows how much work we have ahead of us. But speaking as a member of the seabird conservation team, I'd just like to say to Melissa and Kirsten, who are our policy and advocacy team, what a pleasure it's been to work with you so far, and all the help and input you've given us on these various development applications that we wouldn't have been able to comment on and fight against without your help. So before we get on to a couple of questions, I'd just like to remind everyone to join us again next week for another episode where my colleague Karina Pinar will be talking about the southern bald ibis work that she is doing. So please do join us for that. So Melissa, Alistair, and Kirsten, do you want to turn on your videos and unmute, and then we can go through some questions? And I should have actually introduced Kirsten a bit better earlier on. Sorry about that, Kirsten. She is the advocacy officer at BirdLife South Africa. She is responsible for coordinating a lot of our responses to development applications, and also contributes to our inputs on legal and policy developments. So thanks very much for being here as well. So we have a couple of questions. I think I'll direct the first one to you, Kirsten, and that's from Shashi, asking about fracking for shale gas, and whether that's impacted on marine species and geographical areas. She's asked about internationally as well as locally, but I'm not sure if you know the answer to the international question, but yeah, what can you tell us about fracking?
I can tell you from an international perspective, it has been banned in a number of countries, but it does obviously happen in other countries. From the offshore perspective, there is, contrary to what many people think of fracking as being an onshore activity, there is horizontal drilling that happens offshore, primarily offshore of Mossel Bay, to try and keep that Pequesa plant going, because the gas reserves there are very low. So they do horizontal fracking or horizontal drilling for gas off the coast. And it obviously does add to those cumulative impacts. As far as the onshore is concerned, at the moment, we don't have any extensive onshore horizontal gas fracking for shale gas. However, it's very much on the cards, and we are in the process of commenting on the recently introduced revised fracking regulations. There are other types of drilling for oil and gas that happen in South Africa at the moment, but currently there's no hydraulic fracturing happening. And if it did happen onshore, it wouldn't have any impact on marine species, because it happens in sort of not necessarily near the coast.
Okay, thanks for that. Now the next question is from Penny Abbott, who's one of our regular viewers. And I think maybe I'll put this one to Melissa. To what extent are other stakeholders such as government, Transnet, ports, and shipping industry amenable to BirdLife South Africa's input?
So if we're talking, obviously it depends on the issue involved, and I assume this relates specifically to the ship-to-ship bunkering issue and those and the existing stakeholder engagement platforms. There have been ups and downs, but certainly in the past few months, I feel like there's been far more constructive engagements than there previously has been at times. And certainly in respect of the environmental risk assessments and the comments that we've submitted so far in writing to the Transnet National Ports Authority, they were very receptive to hearing our views and welcomed the information that we had forthcoming publication, which, as Alistair highlighted, has just been published, that will hopefully inform that environmental risk assessment. So obviously the proof's in the pudding. We'll need to see how that assessment plays out, because it hasn't yet commenced. But there has been constructive discussion. Thanks.
Good, thanks for that. Then the next question is from Rosie Shields, asking it's quite a long question. I'm not sure who's best placed to answer this. I don't know, Alistair, if you can, otherwise Melissa. Asking what powers are available to control activities of foreign companies and vessels. So I'm assuming this is about, yes, she's saying, thinking particular about the noise level issues and whether they're required to comply with South African legislation.
I can comment on that portion of the question. I mean, the answer is yes. If they're in South Africa's territorial waters, they'd be subject to our legislation. There again, the challenge is one of enforcement. I think when it comes to an activity such as ship-to-ship bunkering, my understanding is that the authorities are quite rigorous about vetting, or we're informed that they're quite rigorous in vetting foreign vessels before they're authorized to come and bunker in South African waters. A more difficult issue would be how to hold them accountable if they cause damage, and then move off elsewhere. But I don't know whether Alistair has any thoughts specifically on the noise pollution issue in that context.
Thanks, Mel. And thanks for that question. Yeah, so that's a really interesting one and something that I'd need to dig into. But as far as I'm aware, there are international maritime guidelines on noise pollution, but I don't think any of those, some of these other mitigation measures globally by other governments and agencies have been looked at into any meaningful detail in South Africa. So I'm not aware of, any drive to promote slowing down of ships and shipping lanes, for instance, changing the design of propellers, all those sorts of things. But that is certainly something that we would need to talk to the maritime authorities about, and something that we should be involved in more detail in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Given that I'm sure most of the ships that are coming here are actually foreign owned rather than South African ships. I'm just looking at the next question, and that is from Mareka Musin, who, if I remember correctly, used to be at the Two Oceans Aquarium, but I think he's now at Ushaka in Durban, asking about how other conservation and science-based organizations can support, she says you, meaning BirdLife, meaningfully, but I would imagine just be supportive of each other with regards to these impacts and related policy and decision-making on endangered seabirds. Alistair, I know that we've entered into a lot of collaborations with other organizations. Maybe you can give a first answer to this.
Thanks, Mariki. That's actually quite an essential question. And as Christina mentioned, with a lot of these issues we're tackling, we collaborate with partners, with other NGOs, academic institutions, and others, because we all come with different expertise, and collectively we can obviously do a lot better than tackling these all, in our own silos. So it's just a matter of getting involved, making the contact, and seeing how we can, collectively synergize around ameliorating some of these threats as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've definitely found that there is huge value in collaborations, and you can amplify your voice if it's not just one organization, but a whole coalition of them advocating for the same issues. We, I think, have time just for 2 more questions. I'm not quite sure who to direct this one to, from Sharon Fon, asking about the balance between conservation and economic growth and job creation, etc., which is so important in this country. and asking to what extent and how do you engage with local communities who may be impacted by the economic consequences of the decisions? And do we have any long-term activities or data to indicate that communities, the impact of losing diversity on long-term individual and planetary health? So that's quite a complex question. I don't know if anyone wants to give a stab at answering that.
Perhaps I can just say that one thing that we have noticed in the court judgments that have come out, particularly in terms of the interdicts on seismic surveys, is that our judiciary have been very sensitive to balancing those conservation agendas with socioeconomic agendas. And I think that that's where we really recognize the synergy in that the small-scale fisheries and their concerns about their economic well-being have been, and their socioeconomic way of life and well-being has been a really driving force in helping making sure that those interdicts were issued and remain in place. So it does highlight this overlap between the issues that we're fighting for in terms of conservation with the more equally important socioeconomic issues. Yeah, but maybe somebody else wants to also add to our long-term ambitions around educating the public and making them more aware.
Well, I think that the only thing I can add to that is that we are very relieved that recently BirdLife South Africa was finally able to hire an Empowering People project manager. And so this is definitely an area that from policy and advocacy perspective, we recognize we need to pay more attention in the future in collaboration with the Empowering People program. So far in our work, we just haven't had the capacity or expertise to. I don't know whether Alistair has any other thoughts from kind of a marine environment perspective specifically.
No, I think you guys have covered it well. Christina, yeah, sorry, I was just looking up the stats for that last question on the African penguin current numbers.
Yes, so yeah, this is from Pavel, who comes from Poland and works for a zoo there, and he is asking the current numbers for African penguins in South Africa. So, Alistair?
Yeah, so that's good timing because we just received a report from Oceans and Coasts in government. The current latest estimate globally is 14,000 pairs. So they do assess the population in breeding pairs, the easiest way to count them when they're breeding. And of that, I'm just looking, it's just over 10,000 pairs now in South Africa with the latest current estimates. So yeah, very low numbers.
Yeah, very low. It's very concerning that they've, especially in Algoa Bay, where we've focused a lot of the talk tonight on, has also decreased so dramatically. So it highlights the need for our ongoing interventions and work on this area. Yeah, I think we will leave it there. It's almost 8:20, and I think we'll let everyone get on with the rest of their public holiday. So I would just like to say thank you very much to Melissa and Alistair and Kirsten for the very interesting presentation and the discussions now, and thanks for taking the time on this public holiday to join us. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else before we close off.
Just a big thanks to you, Christina, and to everyone for joining this evening.
Yes, thank you to everyone, and thanks for those interesting questions.
Thanks, Christina.
Great. Well, then, thanks very much, everyone, for joining us, and please do join us again next week, same time, same place.